I didn't realize I was the joke until I picked up the place card. It was thick ivory, hand-lettered, placed perfectly between a crystal glass and polished silverware like it belonged in a room where nothing was accidental. For a split second, I actually smiled, thinking someone had taken care with the details. Then I read it. Freeloader. The word sat there, clean and deliberate, not hidden, not subtle, exactly where it could be seen and ignored at the same time. For one suspended heartbeat, everything around me blurred, the chandeliers, the music, the low hum of conversation. Then the laughter started. Soft at first, then spreading, growing more confident as people realized no one was going to stop it. Not nervous laughter. Comfortable laughter. The kind people allow themselves when they believe they're protected by wealth, by status, by the quiet agreement that cruelty doesn't count if everyone pretends it's harmless. I stood there holding that card, my fingers cold, my chest tight, and all I could think was, this was how they chose to introduce me. Not as the sister who raised her, not as someone who belonged, just a label, simple and final, placed in front of hundreds of people like it had always been true. I am Jenna Thompson, 33 years old, and I didn't come to my sister's wedding expecting gratitude. I came because I had earned my place in that room in ways no one there would ever understand. I came as the woman who worked double shifts at 19 so Monica could stay in school, who skipped college so she could have one, who learned how to stretch nothing into enough so she would never feel the kind of fear I grew up with. I didn't need applause. I didn't need a speech. I just thought I deserved to sit at a table without being reduced to something I wasn't. The ballroom was everything you would expect from a wedding designed to impress people who were already impossible to impress. Tall arrangements, soft lighting, servers moving like they had rehearsed every step, conversations that carried the confidence of people who had never had to fight to be taken seriously. I had chosen my dress carefully, something simple, something I could afford without pretending to be someone I wasn't. I remember smoothing the fabric at my waist before picking up that place card, thinking maybe, just for a moment, that I could exist in that space without explanation. But the moment stretched, and no one corrected it. No one laughed and said it was a mistake. No one reached for the card or even looked uncomfortable enough to make it feel accidental. Instead, people looked at me the way you look at something awkward you don't want to engage with, waiting to see how I would handle it so they could decide what it meant. And then I looked at Monica, my sister, the girl I had raised when everything else in our lives had fallen apart. She was standing near the front, her hand resting lightly on her husband's arm, her expression composed, almost practiced. When our eyes met, there was no shock, no confusion, no immediate move to fix what had just happened. Just a pause, brief and controlled, like she had already decided not to step in. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Because humiliation hurts, but recognition changes everything. I wasn't just being mocked by strangers. I was being left there by someone who knew exactly what I had sacrificed to get her to that room. I felt the instinct to leave rise up immediately, sharp and protective. I could see it clearly, walking out without a word, holding on to whatever dignity I had left, refusing to give them the reaction they were waiting for. That would have been the easier choice, the safer one. I lowered the card back onto the table carefully, almost gently, like it was something fragile instead of something designed to break me. My face stayed still even though my heart was pounding, because I had learned a long time ago how to survive without letting it show. I reached for my purse, ready to turn, ready to step out of a room that had just made it clear I didn't belong. And then I heard her voice. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady enough to cut through the noise. Monica moved quickly, crossing the distance between us before I could take a step. Her fingers wrapped around my wrist, firm, almost urgent, and for the first time that night something in her composure cracked. She turned not to me, but to the people watching, to her new family, to the man who stood at the center of all of it. Her eyes locked onto her father-in-law, and when she spoke, her voice was low but unmistakable. Whoever thought humiliating my sister tonight was funny is about to learn how expensive disrespect can be. The room shifted. Conversations stalled, glasses paused mid-air, and for a brief second, it felt like everything might tilt in a different direction. But standing there with her hand still around my wrist and that place card sitting like evidence on the table, I couldn't ignore the feeling settling deeper in my chest. Because if this was her way of defending me, it didn't feel like protection. It felt like the beginning of something I didn't yet understand, and I knew, without being able to explain why, that by the next morning, everything was going to change. The room didn't go back to normal after she said it. It pretended to. Conversations restarted, music swelled just a little louder, servers resumed their quiet choreography, but something underneath had shifted. I could feel it in the way people avoided looking directly at me now, not out of kindness, but because they were recalculating. A moment ago, I had been safe to dismiss. Now I was something else, something they weren't sure how to categorize yet. Monica's hand was still wrapped around my wrist, steady, controlled, and I realized she wasn't just holding me there, she was anchoring the moment, keeping it from slipping too far out of her control. She released me slowly and turned back toward the room with a composed smile that looked practiced, almost rehearsed. "Let's not ruin the evening over a misunderstanding," she said lightly, as if the word misunderstanding could soften what had just happened. A few guests laughed politely, relieved to be given permission to move on. It was subtle, but effective. The tension didn't disappear, it just got pushed beneath the surface where it could be ignored. I didn't move. I stayed where I was, watching her, noticing the details I would have missed before. The tightness in her shoulders that didn't match her tone. The quick glance she cast toward Richard Hallberg before turning back to the guests. It wasn't fear. It wasn't uncertainty. It was awareness. And that realization settled into me quietly, heavier than anything that had happened so far. Because if this had truly been a surprise, she wouldn't be managing it. She would be reacting to it. Richard didn't respond to her warning directly. He didn't need to. Men like him don't escalate unless they're certain of the outcome. Instead, he adjusted the cuff of his jacket, looked at me briefly, and smiled in a way that felt like a test I had already failed. "Of course," he said, his voice just low enough to feel private while still carrying to those closest. "We wouldn't want emotions to overshadow such an important event." The words sounded reasonable, even gracious, but there was something underneath them that didn't match the tone. It wasn't dismissal, it was positioning. I stepped back from the table, leaving the place card exactly where it was. I could feel it pulling attention even without anyone looking at it directly. Like a quiet center point, the entire room was orbiting around. A server passed with a tray of champagne, offering me a glass with a careful neutrality that told me this wasn't the first time he had seen something like this. I took one without thinking, needing something to hold that wasn't my own reaction. As I moved through the room, I started noticing things I hadn't before. Conversations that stopped the second I got close. A woman near the bar leaning toward her husband, whispering something before both of them glanced at me and quickly looked away. A groomsman checking his phone, then looking toward Richard with a subtle nod that didn't belong in a casual setting like this. None of it was obvious on its own, but together it felt coordinated. And then I heard it. Not clearly at first, just fragments carried through the noise. After tonight, clean break, no more influence. I slowed without turning, letting the words come into focus just enough to understand the tone, if not every detail. The voices were coming from a small group near the edge of the dance floor, where Richard stood with two men in suits and one of Monica's new relatives. They weren't trying to be overheard, but they weren't worried about it either. That kind of confidence only comes from believing the outcome is already decided. I didn't move closer. I didn't need to, because the pieces were already starting to align in a way I hadn't expected. This wasn't just about embarrassing me. It was about redefining my place in Monica's life in a way that couldn't be reversed without consequences. The place card wasn't the insult. It was the message. For a moment, my mind pulled backward without warning. A small kitchen, a stack of unpaid bills, Monica at 14 pretending she didn't care that she couldn't go on a school trip because we couldn't afford it. Me picking up another shift the next day without telling her why. That memory hit harder than anything happening in that room because it reminded me exactly what had been built and exactly what was being rewritten now. I forced myself back into the present before it could take hold. This wasn't the time to feel. It was the time to understand. When I looked up again, Monica was across the room, smiling, speaking with guests like nothing had happened. But every so often her eyes flicked toward Richard, quick and controlled, like she was checking something invisible. Approval, alignment, control. It was subtle, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. And that was when the second realization settled in, colder than the first. Whatever was happening here, she wasn't outside of it. She was part of it. Maybe not leading it, maybe not fully understanding it, but she was allowing it. I set my champagne glass down untouched and shifted my position, giving myself a wider view of the room. The music had picked up again. Couples moving toward the dance floor, laughter returning in small, careful bursts. The performance was back, but I could see the structure underneath it now, the hierarchy, the quiet agreements, the way power moved without ever needing to raise its voice. I didn't feel like leaving anymore. That instinct had passed, replaced by something steadier, sharper, because walking away would mean accepting what they had decided I was. And for the first time that night, I realized I wasn't ready to do that. Somewhere behind me, a voice lowered into a near whisper said, "It had to be done." I didn't turn. I didn't react. But I heard it clearly enough to understand what it meant. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a joke. It was a decision. And if it was a decision, then it had a purpose. The only question left was how far they were willing to go to make sure it worked. I woke up at 6:08 a.m., to the sound of my phone vibrating against the nightstand, sharp and insistent in a way that didn't belong to anything good. For a moment, I stayed still, staring at the ceiling, hoping it would stop, hoping whatever waited on the other side of that screen could be delayed by a few seconds of silence. It buzzed again and again. I reached for it, already knowing something had shifted. The first thing I saw was an email subject line, then another, then a missed call from Daniel. My chest tightened before I even opened anything, because somewhere deep down I understood that whatever started in that ballroom hadn't ended there. The first email was polite. Too polite. The kind of language people use when they want to disappear without leaving fingerprints. After careful reconsideration, we've decided to withdraw our support from the Community Literacy Initiative. No explanation, no warning, just a clean exit. I read it twice, then a third time, like the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They didn't. That project had been in review for months. We had passed every stage. We were days away from approval. Things like that don't collapse overnight unless someone makes them. My phone rang again. "Daniel," I answered immediately. "Tell me you saw it," he said, his voice tight, controlled in that way people sound when they're trying not to panic. "I saw it," I replied, keeping my own voice steady. There was a pause, then a breath on the other end. "They didn't just pull funding," he said. "My firm just called. They're suspending my involvement with the project, effective immediately." That hit harder than the email. Because Daniel didn't work for the foundation. He worked for a consulting firm that had nothing to do with our grant directly, which meant this wasn't one decision. It was pressure, coordinated, precise, fast. I sat up slowly, my mind already moving past shock into something sharper. "Did they say why?" I asked. Another pause. "No," he said, "just that it wasn't aligned with their current priorities." He let out a short breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "They wouldn't even say your name." I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, staring at the floor for a second before standing. Timing. That was the first thing that settled into place. The wedding had ended less than 10 hours ago. These emails were sent at dawn. No one restructures decisions like that overnight without preparation. This had started before I ever picked up that place card. "Jenna," Daniel said more quietly now, "what happened last night?" I didn't answer right away. Saying it out loud would make it real in a way I wasn't ready for. "I'll explain," I said finally. "But first I need to know something. Did anyone contact you yesterday? Before this?" He hesitated. "Not long. Just enough. Someone from Halberg Capital reached out in the afternoon," he admitted. "Asked questions about the project, about you." There it was. Not coincidence, not bad timing, a move. "What kind of questions?" I asked. "Background stuff," he said. "Your role, your influence, whether the project could continue without you." I stopped moving. The room felt quieter suddenly, like the air had shifted. "And what did you say?" I asked. "I said no," he replied immediately. "I said you built it, that without you there is no project." His voice softened slightly, "Which is why none of this makes sense." But it did make sense, just not the way he thought. Because if someone wanted to remove me, they wouldn't attack me directly. They would dismantle everything around me until there was nothing left to stand on. "You need to step back for now," I said. "What, Jenna?" "No," he protested. "I'm not walking away." "You're not," I replied. "You're protecting yourself until we understand what this is." There was a longer pause this time. "You think this is connected?" he said slowly. "I know it is," I answered. After I hung up, the silence came back heavier than before. I walked into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and took a sip even though my throat felt tight. My phone buzzed again. A message, unknown number. "You were never meant to stay." I stared at it, reading it over and over, the words simple but precise. Not a threat, more like confirmation. I checked the number, but it gave me nothing. A burner, disposable, intentional. I set the phone down carefully, my mind replaying the night before with new clarity. Richard's voice, his certainty, the way he spoke about value like it was something people like me had to prove. This wasn't about embarrassment. It was about removal. A knock at the door pulled me out of my thoughts. I froze for a second before moving toward it. Mrs. Alvarez stood there, holding a small envelope. "This was left downstairs," she said, offering it to me. "It has your name on it." I took it, thanked her, and closed the door. It felt heavier than it should have. No return address, just my name written clean across the front. I opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Printed. One sentence. "Some people should remember where they came from." I let out a slow breath, folding the paper once before setting it next to my phone. The pieces weren't scattered anymore. They fit, too cleanly. This wasn't a reaction. It was a system. And they weren't just trying to humiliate me. They were trying to erase me. I didn't respond to the message, didn't call anyone back, didn't try to defend myself or explain what had happened. By mid-morning, the silence I chose started to feel deliberate, almost structured, like the first decision I had made that wasn't a reaction. Because reacting would have been easy, and easy is predictable, and predictable is controllable. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, the withdrawal email, the anonymous message, and the printed note laid out in front of me like pieces of something I hadn't finished assembling yet. I went back to the timeline, not the emotional one, but the actual sequence of events. The wedding, Richard's comments, the fragments I overheard about a clean break, the email, Daniel's call, the contact from Halberg Capital before anything officially changed. It wasn't random. It was layered. And more importantly, it was planned. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me careful, because anger pushes forward. Care moves differently. Around 11:30 a.m., my phone rang again, and this time the name made me pause. Natalie Whitmore. I recognized it immediately, even though we had only spoken once months ago. She was Monica's cousin on her husband's side, quiet, observant, the kind of person who noticed more than she said. I let it ring once before answering. "Jenna," she said, her voice low, hesitant, like she wasn't sure she should be calling. "Yes," I replied. There was a pause, then a breath. "I think you need to see something." I didn't ask what. I didn't need to. "Where are you?" I said instead. She gave me the name of a small cafe downtown, nowhere near the places her family usually went. That detail mattered more than anything else she could have said. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, I told her, already reaching for my bag. The cafe was quiet, filled with people working and pretending not to notice each other. Natalie was in the corner, sitting too still, a phone and a small envelope placed neatly in front of her. When she saw me, she didn't smile. She just nodded like she had rehearsed this moment and didn't trust herself to deviate. I sat across from her, setting my bag down slowly. "You said I needed to see something," I said. She slid the envelope toward me without speaking. Inside was a USB drive, simple, unmarked. I looked up at her. "What is this?" I asked. "It's not everything," she said, "but it's enough." That choice of words settled immediately. Not everything. Enough. I pulled out my laptop, plugged it in, and opened the file. The video was grainy, clearly recorded without permission. A private dining room, dim lighting, 4 people at the table. I recognized Richard instantly, leaning back in his chair, relaxed, confident, a glass in his hand. Across from him sat Monica, my sister. I felt something tighten in my chest, but I didn't look away. I focused on the details instead, the tone, the posture, the lack of hesitation. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a discussion, structured, intentional. "It's not about cruelty," Richard was saying, his voice calm, almost amused. "It's about alignment. You don't bring someone like that into a new structure unless you're prepared for the consequences." Monica nodded slightly, not in shock, not in protest, just acknowledgement. The clip cut, then resumed from a slightly different angle. "Public perception matters," Richard continued. "If you don't establish boundaries early, people assume access, influence, and influence becomes entitlement." This time, Monica spoke. "And if she doesn't accept it?" she asked. There was no hesitation in her voice, no disbelief, just calculation. Richard smiled. "Then you make sure she doesn't have a platform to resist from." The video ended. No resolution, no denial, just enough to make the intention clear. I closed the laptop slowly, the silence between us stretching. Natalie watched me carefully, like she was waiting for something that didn't come. "How did you get this?" I asked. "Someone recorded it 2 nights before the wedding," she said. "They weren't supposed to share it. But after what happened?" She trailed off, shaking her head slightly. I couldn't ignore it. I nodded once. This wasn't last minute. It wasn't reactive. It was planned. The place card wasn't an insult. It was a signal. "You said this isn't everything," I reminded her. "There's more," she said. "Conversations, emails, I don't have all of it. But I know what they were trying to do." She leaned forward slightly. "They didn't just want to embarrass you. They wanted to remove you, completely." That confirmed what I already knew, but hearing it out loud changed something. Not emotionally, strategically, because now I wasn't guessing anymore. I had evidence and context. "Why are you giving this to me?" I asked. She met my eyes. "Because you're not what they said you were," she said quietly, "and because if you don't see this, they win without anyone questioning it." I sat back, my mind already moving ahead. If I released this now, it would create noise, attention, but not control. They would deny it, reframe it, call it emotional retaliation. I had seen that pattern before. "No," I said quietly. Natalie frowned. "No," she repeated. "I'm not using this yet," I said, closing the laptop. "If I do it now, it becomes a reaction, and reactions are easy to dismiss." I looked at her again. I need them to say it again, in a room where they think they're still in control. Understanding spread across her face slowly. "You want them to expose themselves," she said. I shook my head slightly. "I want them to confirm it," I replied, on record, without realizing they're doing it. She leaned back, exhaling. "That's risky." "So is doing nothing," I said. I slipped the USB into my bag and stood. The fear was still there, but it had changed. It wasn't stopping me anymore. It was guiding me. Because for the first time since I picked up that place card, I wasn't reacting to what they had done. I was deciding what happened next. I didn't contact Monica right away. That would have been too easy for her to control, too predictable for them to prepare around. Instead, I waited. Not passively, but deliberately, letting the silence sit just long enough to make them believe I was still reacting, still off balance. In reality, I was building something underneath that they wouldn't see coming, because it required restraint, and people like Richard don't expect restraint from someone they've already dismissed. The first call I made was to Daniel. I didn't explain everything, not yet, but I gave him enough to shift his position without exposing the full picture. "You were right to step back," I told him. "I need you to document everything that's happened since yesterday. Every email, every call, every delay." He didn't argue this time. Something in my voice must have told him this wasn't panic anymore. This was direction. "You think we can prove it?" he asked. I paused for half a second before answering. "I think they're going to prove it for us." After that, I went through everything again, but differently. Not as separate incidents, but as parts of a sequence. The withdrawal email, the anonymous message, the printed note, the recording Natalie gave me. Each piece wasn't just evidence, it was a step, a method. Influence applied quietly, pressure without accountability, control without exposure. That pattern mattered more than any single detail, because patterns don't disappear when challenged. They reveal themselves more clearly. By late afternoon, I finally texted Monica. Not emotional, not confrontational, just enough to open a door she would feel comfortable stepping through. "We need to talk," I wrote. "Not about the wedding, about everything that comes after." I chose each word carefully, knowing she would read it as an opportunity, not a threat. Within minutes, she responded. "I was going to say the same thing. Let's do it properly. Properly." That word told me everything. She wasn't preparing to apologize. She was preparing to manage. We agreed to meet 2 days later at Richard's house. Not a neutral space, not mine, his, which meant he would feel in control, which meant he would speak more freely. Exactly what I needed. That night, I prepared. Not dramatically, not emotionally, but with precision. I bought a small digital recorder, simple and reliable, the kind used for interviews. I tested it twice, making sure it picked up voices clearly across a room, that it wouldn't distort or cut out. Then I thought through every possible outcome. If he denied everything, I would press for clarification. If he minimized, I would ask for specifics. If he justified, I would let him continue. The goal wasn't to confront, it was to listen. The next morning, another message came through, this time from someone inside the foundation. Just one sentence. "I'm sorry. This wasn't our decision. No name, no explanation. But it confirmed what I already understood. The pressure wasn't imagined. It was real, and it was coming from somewhere above them." I didn't respond. I added it to the pattern, another quiet piece that would matter later. On the day of the meeting, I dressed simply. Navy blouse, black slacks, low heels, nothing that could be used to distract from what I was there to do. I stood in front of the mirror for a moment before leaving, not looking for confidence, but for clarity. I didn't need to win. I needed to control the moment. When I arrived, the gates were already open. That detail didn't go unnoticed. It meant they were expecting me, watching for me, ready to receive me on their terms. Inside, the house was exactly what I had imagined. Immaculate, controlled, designed to impress without revealing anything real. Monica was waiting near the entrance, her posture composed, her expression softer than it had been at the wedding, but her eyes were the same. Alert. Measuring. "You came," she said, stepping forward. I nodded. "You asked for a conversation," I replied. "So let's have one." She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then gestured toward the sitting room. "He's already inside," she said quietly. "Not our parents, not anyone else. Him." That was who this meeting was really about. As I walked into the room, I saw Richard immediately. Seated, relaxed, as if this were a discussion he had already decided the outcome of. Beside him sat a man I didn't recognize but could identify instantly as legal counsel. Silent, observing, a witness or a shield, depending on how this unfolded. That shifted the dynamic slightly, but not enough to change the plan. Because even with a lawyer present, people like Richard don't stop talking. They just choose their words more carefully. And careful words still reveal intention if you listen closely enough. I sat across from them, placing my bag at my feet, my posture steady, my expression neutral. No anger, no accusation, just presence. Monica took a seat beside me, close enough to suggest alignment, far enough to maintain distance. Richard leaned forward slightly, folding his hands together. "I assume this is about the scene at the wedding," he said, his tone measured, almost patient. I met his gaze without flinching. "No," I said calmly. "This is about everything that happened after." For the first time since I entered the room, something shifted. Subtle, but real. Because now the conversation wasn't about embarrassment, it was about consequence, and that was a language he understood. I let the silence stretch just long enough for him to fill it. And when he did, I was ready, not to argue, but to listen for the truth he wouldn't be able to hide. Richard didn't answer immediately. He studied me first, the way someone evaluates risk before deciding how much truth they can afford to reveal. The lawyer beside him remained still, eyes attentive, absorbing everything without participating. Monica shifted slightly next to me, just enough for me to feel the tension in her without needing to look. The room was quiet in a controlled way, the kind of silence designed to make the person with less power speak first. I didn't feel it. "I'm not sure what you mean," Richard said finally, his tone smooth, almost conversational. "The Foundation's decision has nothing to do with us. These things happen." He leaned back slightly, like that explanation should settle the matter. I let a few seconds pass before responding. Then it should be easy to explain why Halberg Capital contacted my partner hours before the funding was withdrawn. My voice stayed even, controlled, not challenging, just precise. The lawyer's gaze shifted subtly toward Richard. Not alarmed, but attentive in a different way now. Richard didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on me. "We evaluate many opportunities," he said. "Due diligence is standard." "That's not what I asked," I replied calmly. "I asked why they were asking whether the project could continue without me." That broke his rhythm. Not dramatically, but enough. Monica turned her head slightly, her eyes flicking toward him, then back to me. There it was again. Not surprise. Awareness. Richard exhaled softly, adjusting his posture. "You're interpreting routine business inquiries as something personal," he said. "That's understandable, given the circumstances." "So it's personal when I interpret it," I said quietly. "But not when funding disappears overnight. My partner is pressured to step away, and I receive messages telling me I was never meant to stay." The word messages lingered in the room longer than anything else. The lawyer shifted again, more noticeably this time. Richard's expression tightened, just for a second. "If you're suggesting I'm responsible for every inconvenience you experience," he said, his tone sharpening slightly, "that's not only inaccurate, it's unreasonable." Inconvenience," I repeated, letting the word settle. "Is that what you call removing 2 years of work?" Monica finally spoke, her voice lower now, controlled but strained. "Jenna, this isn't helping." I turned to look at her fully. "Then what is?" I asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, silence seems to be working very well for everyone except me." She didn't answer directly. Her eyes dropped briefly before lifting again, more composed. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be," she said. That was the first admission, not of facts, but of existence. Something can't be bigger than it needs to be unless it already exists. Richard picked up on it immediately. "Exactly," he said, reclaiming control. "There's no reason to escalate this. Your sister is building a new life. That requires boundaries." There it was. the word he had been circling since the wedding. Boundaries, clean, respectable, justifiable. I leaned back slightly, mirroring his posture. And those boundaries include publicly humiliating me? That, he said smoothly, was unfortunate, but it served a purpose. The lawyer turned his head slightly at that, not enough to interrupt, just enough to register the shift. I didn't react outwardly. I let him continue. Perception matters, Richard said, his voice steadier now. If you don't establish structure early, people assume access, influence, and influence complicates decision-making. Decision-making for who? I asked. For the family, he replied without hesitation, for the stability of what's being built. Monica inhaled quietly beside me, like she wanted to speak, then stopped. I nodded slowly. So, removing me was part of that structure. Richard didn't deny it. He didn't soften it. He chose precision. Minimizing external influence was necessary, he said. That was it. Not emotional, not defensive, just clear. I let a few seconds pass before speaking again. And the project? I asked. Was that part of minimizing influence too? He hesitated, briefly, but enough. Opportunities shift, he said. Resources are reallocated. That's how business works. Because of you, I said quietly. He didn't respond, and in that moment, his silence said more than anything else he could have. The lawyer finally spoke, his tone measured. We should be careful about making direct attributions without evidence. I turned slightly toward him. I agree, I said. That's why I'm asking questions instead of making accusations. That repositioned the room again, subtly but decisively, because now this wasn't confrontation. It was documentation. Monica looked at me then, really looked this time, and something in her expression shifted. Not fully, not completely, but enough to show the edge of something she hadn't revealed before. Doubt. Jenna, she said quietly, what do you want from this? I held her gaze. Clarity, I said. Nothing more. Richard let out a soft breath, almost amused again. Clarity is simple, he said. You don't fit into the structure we're building. And rather than allow that misalignment to create complications, we addressed it early. There it was, finally, without disguise. I nodded once, slowly, committing every word to memory, every tone, every pause. Because this was exactly what I needed. Not anger, not denial, just truth, spoken plainly enough that it couldn't be rewritten later. And in that moment, I knew the conversation had already given me everything I came for. I didn't argue with him after that. I didn't raise my voice, didn't try to force him to see something he had already decided didn't matter. I let the silence settle in the room, heavy and deliberate, and then I reached down calmly for my bag. Monica watched me closely, her expression tightening in a way she couldn't fully control now. Richard leaned back, the faintest trace of satisfaction returning to his posture, like he believed the conversation had ended exactly the way he wanted. What are you doing? Monica asked, her voice low but sharp enough to break the stillness. I looked at her without hesitation. I'm done asking questions, I said. There was a brief pause, confusion flickering across her face before it shifted into something more defensive. You're overreacting, she said, faster now, less controlled. This didn't have to become a confrontation. I nodded slightly. You're right, I replied. It didn't. Richard gave a small, almost approving smile, as if he thought I had finally accepted the structure he had defined. Then I'm glad we can move forward, he said. These misunderstandings don't need to define anything. That was when I reached into my bag and took out my phone. Not quickly, not dramatically. Just enough to redirect attention without breaking the calm I had maintained the entire time. I placed it on the table between us and tapped the screen once. His voice filled the room. If you don't establish structure early, people assume access, influence, and influence becomes entitlement. For a moment, no one moved. The sound of his own words, stripped of control, echoed through the quiet space. Monica's head snapped toward the phone, her eyes widening for the first time since I walked in. The lawyer straightened, his composure shifting just enough to reveal concern. I let the clip continue. Not everything. Just enough. Enough to anchor what had just been said in something that couldn't be reframed. Richard's expression changed slowly, the confidence draining not into panic but into calculation. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice quieter now. I didn't answer. I pressed play again. "Then you make sure she doesn't have a platform to resist from." This time, the silence that followed wasn't controlled. It was exposed. Monica stood abruptly, her chair scraping softly against the floor. "Jenna," she said, her voice unsteady now, "you can't just—" "I already did," I replied. Her confusion sharpened. "What does that mean?" I met her gaze without flinching. "It means this conversation isn't private anymore." The words landed harder than anything else I had said, because this wasn't about what they could manage in this room. It was about what had already left it. Richard leaned forward suddenly, his control cracking for the first time. "You posted this?" he demanded. I let the question sit for a moment before answering. "Yes," I said, "along with everything else." The lawyer stood then, stepping closer to Richard, his voice low but urgent. "We need to contain this immediately," he said. Monica shook her head, backing away slightly, her composure slipping. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice breaking. "We could have handled this privately." I looked at her, really looked this time, seeing the difference between who she had been and who she had chosen to become. "You already handled it privately," I said. "This is just what it looks like when it isn't hidden." Richard stood more slowly, his expression hardening again, but it wasn't the same confidence as before. There was tension now, urgency. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "I made it visible." He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face before looking back at me. "People will question your motives," he said. "They'll say this is resentment, that you're reacting emotionally." "Or they'll listen," I said quietly. That stopped him. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was simple. My phone vibrated once on the table, then again, then continuously, notifications stacking faster than I could read them, messages, mentions, calls. I didn't look down. I didn't need to. I knew what was happening without seeing it. The story was moving. Monica stared at the phone, then back at me, her face pale. "You've destroyed everything," she whispered. I shook my head slightly. "No," I said. "I didn't destroy anything." I held her gaze for a moment longer before adding, "I just stopped protecting it." No one spoke after that. Not Richard, not the lawyer, not Monica, because there was nothing left to negotiate. No version of this that could be reshaped into something controlled or contained. I picked up my phone, slipped it back into my bag, and stood. No one told me to sit down. No one tried to stop me, because for the first time since I walked into that house, the control in the room no longer belonged to them. And as I turned and walked out, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel relieved. I felt clear, because whatever came next wouldn't be hidden, and it wouldn't be decided without me. By the time I got back to my apartment, the story had already moved beyond me. My phone didn't stop vibrating, messages stacking faster than I could read them, emails from people I didn't know, notifications from platforms I barely used. The recording, the place card, the timeline I posted alongside it, none of it needed explanation. It was simple, clear, and people understood exactly what they were seeing. I sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I had spent years planning something that almost disappeared overnight, and I let the noise exist without stepping into it. Because this wasn't about attention. It was about control. For the first time since that night, I wasn't reacting. I was watching consequences unfold. By the next morning, the first statement came out. Hallberg Capital announced that Richard Hallberg was stepping back pending internal review. The language was careful, distant, designed to create space without admitting fault. but the shift was there. Within hours, 2 major partners suspended their agreements. A nonprofit board quietly removed his name. It wasn't framed as punishment. It never is. It was framed as alignment, as standards, as values. The same language he had used, just pointed in a different direction. Monica didn't call me that day, or the next. When she finally did, it wasn't from her usual number. I almost didn't answer, but I did. Her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it, stripped of everything she had carried so confidently before. "I didn't think it would go this far," she said. I closed my eyes for a second before responding. "It was already this far," I said. "You just didn't see it yet." There was silence on the line, long and heavy. "He's losing everything," she said finally. Not with anger, not even with sadness, just realization. I thought about that for a moment, about what everything meant to someone like him: reputation, influence, access, all the things that allowed him to decide outcomes without ever needing to explain them. "No," I said quietly, "he's losing what he built on." She didn't argue. She couldn't. Because for the first time, the structure she had chosen to trust was visible without its polish. Not controlled, not curated, just exposed. "I didn't know how to stop it," she admitted. "Not without losing everything I was about to have." That was the closest she had come to honesty since the wedding. I let her speak. I thought if I stayed quiet, it would settle, that it wouldn't matter as much as it did. Her voice cracked slightly, and for a moment, I heard the version of her I used to protect. But that version wasn't the one who made the decision. "You didn't stay quiet," I said. "You agreed." The silence that followed was heavier than anything else she had said. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I looked out the window, watching the city move the way it always does, steady, indifferent. "I know," I said, and I did. "But understanding doesn't undo a choice." "I don't expect you to forgive me," she added quickly. "I'm not trying to punish you," I replied. "I'm just not going to pretend it didn't happen. That was the boundary, clear, final, not emotional, not loud, just there." We didn't say much after that. There wasn't anything left to negotiate. When the call ended, I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel closure the way people describe it. I felt something steadier, like a line had been drawn that wouldn't move again. A week later, the foundation reached out again. Not with an apology, not directly, but with reconsideration. Different board members, different terms, independent this time, smaller funding, but real, enough to rebuild. Daniel came back to the project quietly. No announcement, just a message that said, "We're not done." 3 months later, I stood inside a small community space that hadn't existed before any of this happened. Shelves filled with books, tables set for kids who would walk in after school, nothing extravagant, nothing designed to impress. Just something real. Something that didn't depend on anyone's approval to exist. People ask me sometimes if it was worth it. If exposing everything, if refusing to stay quiet, if choosing truth over comfort cost more than it gave back. I never answer that the way they expect, because it was never about winning. It was about not disappearing in a story someone else decided to write for me. And if you've ever been in a room where people decided who you were without asking, where silence felt safer than truth, where walking away felt easier than standing your ground, then you already understand what this really was. So I want to ask you something. If you were in that moment, would you have walked away to protect your peace or stayed long enough to make the truth impossible to ignore? I read every comment, every story you share, because these situations happen more often than people admit. And if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of your own boundaries, your own choices, then stay with this channel. Share your perspective below and be part of a space where stories like this don't stay hidden and where your voice actually matters. This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.